We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contention.
In this podcast, we are continuing to read from The Eye of Faith, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. We are reading from Chapter 8, Depression, a Second World War and Wider Quaker Service, 1930 to 1950. This chapter has 3 sections. The first 2 sections will cover the 1930s, and the final section will cover the 1940s. In this podcast, we will read Section 2. For many Ohio Friends, the American Friends Service Committee became an ever more familiar organization during the 1930s, as it would set up relief and work programs in Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, and Kentucky. But support for the AFSC was not unanimous. At the Saturday evening meeting, sponsored by the Alumni Association, during the 1931 yearly meeting, for instance, Clarence Pickett of the AFSC outlined AFSC's plans for helping the distressed coalfield families in the area. Although he was warmly welcomed that evening, his presence at yearly meeting was not officially recorded. From the records of the yearly meeting and the meeting of sufferings, one would not even know that the American Friends Service Committee existed during the 1930s. At the request of AFSC's Homer Morris, a group gathered at the boarding school in December of 1931 to consider how to begin a program of child feeding near Wheeling, West Virginia. They set up an 11-person committee which persuaded Laura Hoyle to undertake the role of supervisor. Her task was to survey the territory, make the initial contact with school authorities, and get the assent and cooperation of the local people who would prepare and serve the food and distribute clothing. She also was responsible for purchasing the food with AFSC funds and exercising general oversight of the program. Because the need was urgent, she was able to get the first free lunch program underway by January 7, 1932, in 2 schools in Triadelphia, just east of Wheeling. By the 18th, 6 schools in the area of Triadelphia and Elm Grove were in the program. Apparently, the various neighborhoods of Ohio Yearly Meeting sent loads of food and clothing to West Virginia and Kentucky during the period of most severe deprivation before the government aid could take over. The boarding school sent apples, and boarding school students helped send supplies to the depressed area. Other conservative friends involved in the relief work were Arthur and Ade Gamble, who had sold their farm in Winona and were working for the AFSC in Kentucky before the end of 1931. Ambrose Myers of Barnesville was also in Kentucky, while Milford Mott was in Illinois. At the next yearly alumni meeting in 1932, Arthur and Ada Gamble told of their challenging work among the miners in Kentucky and of how they tried to bring not only food and clothing, but also hope and cooperation into a climate of mistrust, violence, and intemperance. At the time, Arthur supervised AFSC work in a 9-county area, when Ada was responsible for the feeding of 2,000 children in 24 schools. By 1934, the Milford and Edith Mott were also doing AFSC work in Kentucky. The summers of 1934 and 1935 saw the spread of new social intervention, the work camp, into Ohio Yearly Meeting territory. In 1934, the AFSC's first American camp was at Westmoreland Homesteads, a government subsistence project located in a depressed coal mining area near Pittsburgh. The only graduates who wrote about these and similar projects often mentioned Richard Gregg's book, The Power of Nonviolence, the example of Gandhi in India, and the hope that work in these camps might become the moral equivalent of war. A typical AFSC work camp brought together a group of young volunteers who paid for the privilege of living, working, and worshiping together while doing significant work in a depressed community. The first camp was so successful that AFSC sponsored 4 in the summer of 1935. One of these was again at Westmoreland Homesteads, where William and Marion T. Byerly were located, and one was at the Neffs, a mining community in Belmont County, Ohio. The group at Neffs brought a community swimming pool seeking to apply a tiny dose of Christian love in the wound in a community where conflict prevails and to study the situation causing conflict. They also had some chance to interact with Ohio yearly meetings since Harrisville, Flushing, Stillwater, Ridge, and Richland meetings, and in parentheses, Coleraine was being laid down at this time, close parentheses, were within easy driving distance. For example, Tom Ritchie and 2 other people from the camp at Ness were at the Ohio Young Friends gathering near Harrisville that summer. Carl Patterson was another friend who played an important role during the 1930s, both as a beloved minister and leader within the yearly meeting, and also as an effective minister emissary in the world beyond. By the time of his concern to travel abroad in 1931, he had become a recorded minister for nearly 20 years and clerk of the yearly meeting from 1915 to 1926. And he made several ministerial visits to other conservative yearly meetings and Philadelphia. He was quietly effective and widely trusted in his profession as a small-town banker, and he was active in many local, regional, and state organizations, not only banking associations, but every organization in the community that had for its purpose the improvement of the people morally, intellectually, or spiritually had his active as well as his financial support. In 1931, Women's Yearly Meeting ended with a reference to Carl Patterson's concern to travel to Ireland, England, and Europe with Mifflin, a clerk of the Men's Yearly Meeting, as his companion. We were dipped in the great tenderness and sympathy with the prospect of extended labor laid before the yearly meeting. When one is called into weighty service, the whole meeting as individuals should share the burden. Their burden was also shared by friends in Philadelphia. A letter from William Biddle to Mifflin's Hall's wife tells how Carl and Mifflin were met at Broad Street Station and taken as guests to a Philadelphia Orthodox yearly meeting to the Friends Arch Street Center, which then included a Quaker hotel and restaurant. And after a conference with Anna Walton on the German situation, they had lunch with Francis and Ann Walton, William P. Harvey, William Elkton, and William Biddle, and embarked in William Calpratt's auto for New York. When Carl and Mifflin entered their hotel room in New York that evening, they were astonished to find that William Biddle, who had said farewell in Philadelphia, was in the room. He had beaten them by taking a train. After dinner, they met with another group eager to be with Carl and Mifflin one more time. Chester and Florence Emmons, Arthur and Edith Stratton, Roger Edgerton, Anne Newland, Alice Edgerton Rothschild, Josephine Allen, and Anna Kirk, all young and transplanted conservative friends. After a pleasant conversation and discussion of the trip, the group quickly fell into a silence when a dear concerned friend offered a sweet prayer. Shortly after noon the next day, Carl and Mifflin were on their way across the Atlantic. Further evidence of their spiritual support was the collection of 41 letters which awaited Carl when they went on shipboard. The next day, Sunday, he wrote, "We are brought low with so much done for us, and the love and sympathy and prayers of our friends. I remarked to Mifflin this morning that in many meeting houses today, our friends were remembering us to the throne of grace. And I'm aware that it is not only in the meeting that we are being remembered. Like other Quaker ministers before him, Carl Patterson was granted permission to speak during the next Sunday's shipboard service, but on the second full day at sea, he had an opportunity with the boys or pages on the ship. All were respectful, and some were tender, and later I was interested in seeing their faces light up as I passed by and spoke. This was one more evidence of Carl's magnetic and healing presence. The same quality was evident in Ireland, where so far those who've attended meeting at some place with us come from miles to be with us again. Apparently, my short messages am leaving a savor of life that tenders. At Ireland yearly meeting, Carl and Mifflin were well received, although the secretary pointed out to the meeting, in his witty, keen way, that Ohio yearly meeting would not recognize Ireland yearly meeting. At that point, Carl effectively ended Wilburite isolationism by replying in such a way that the whole meeting burst out laughing, and they received my remarks sympathetically. After 2 genial but busy weeks with Irish friends, Carl and Mifflin crossed to England with their first stop among conservative friends at Fritchley, where they had 2 occasions and attended meeting, at which Carl spoke at a good deal more length than usual, and I believe to the comfort of the meeting. They are much discouraged. Unlike James Henderson and early conservative ministers, Carl and Mifflin were welcomed by London's Meeting for Sufferings, which Carl found an interesting and solid body. When they attended London yearly meeting, where they were awed by the visitors around the world, they were again welcomed during the sessions and in many homes afterwards. Through it all, Carl and Mifflin were often given messages to speak. At times, Carl found this difficult because English friends were less likely than Americans to express their feelings after such a meeting. However, both Carl and Mifflin were occasionally quite reassured by both Irish and English friends that their ministry and accurately speaking to conditions. After a very busy month in England, Carl and Mifflin went to Norway with Ronald Littleboy, an English friend, to attend their yearly meeting and visited among the friends. Next, they went to Denmark for another yearly meeting and more visits. Fortunately, there were many people, especially among friends and seekers, who could speak English. Then, after a short time, friends in Hamburg and Amsterdam, Carl and Mifflin returned to London for another session of the Meetings of Sufferings. In both the American Committee, which had arranged many of the details of the visits, and the Meeting for Sufferings, they were warmly received and were given warm returning minutes. Here, as in Ireland, Ohio yearly meeting, Wilburite isolation was ended by Carl and Mifflin. As Carl prepared to leave England, he wrote, "Ohio yearly meeting means something very different than it did when we came. The clerk thought we were people apart, but they found that we enjoyed life, and that this enjoyment did not interfere or detract from our interest in the things of God." Anna and Howard Brenton, who were in England at the time, said the British friends were quite impressed by Carl Patterson, and Anna Brenton enjoyed telling how Carl reported, probably to the Meeting of Sufferings, that he felt that the Norwegian friends looked too much to London yearly meeting for authority, and that he had directed them to a higher source. When Carl and Mifflin returned to America about a month before the 1932 Ohio yearly meeting, they brought not only a deep sense that their journey had been right ordering and that their way had opened in many ways, but also a deep conviction that Ohio yearly meeting should open communications with all other yearly meetings, especially those who they had just visited. Following the ancient patterns, they returned their minutes to Friday's meeting for ministers and elders, and they gave such an inspiring account of their journey that at the end of the first session of yearly meeting the next morning, the shutters which divided the men and women were opened so that Carl and Mifflin might report to the whole yearly meeting. Their report described a tendering time, must have set the tone for an unusually inspired yearly meeting, for the yearly meeting decided to print a 4-page message to its absent members, including 3 paragraphs about Carl and Mifflin's report, even including the part of the epistles from Ireland and London, which could not yet be printed officially in the yearly meeting minutes. When someone proposed sending short messages of love to some meetings visited by our friends Carl Patterson and Mifflin Hall, the meeting was dipped into a deep exercise. A committee was appointed, however, including young, non-resident history professor and international traveler Willis Hall. From at least 1931 onward, there had been efforts to recognize and answer the epistles from other yearly meetings, and Carl and Mifflin's experiences must have had a strong influence on the fact that some European epistles were also answered in 1933 and in 1934 at the urging of the Women's Meeting, and the practice of sending general epistles was finally begun in 1935. Ohio Yearly Meeting was clearly rejoining the wider worldwide Society of Friends, in spite of continuing strong resistance by a few people. Carl Patterson was very important to Ohio Yearly Meeting and its evolution during this period. Carl was loved and followed because he had a keen, intelligent business sense and richly sensitive to God's dedicated mind. There was a combination of Ohio friends valued. Further, he was in touch with his deeper emotions. He felt great affection for the people around him, like Anne Branson and James Henderson. He often followed his inward guide so closely that people might wonder if he had been given a secret information about them when he spoke a meeting of during or doing an opportunity. Like other ministers, he knew that failure to follow his inward guide would lead to a painful sense of uneasiness. However, he was free of the restraint which made some traditional Quakers seem old-fashioned and out of the mainstream of American life. Carl clearly saw the dangers of restricting the ministry and other leadership to just a few plain friends. He dreamed at a time when anyone in a friends meeting, and not just be predictable and elderly few, or at least sometimes be inspired to speak in meeting. Probably only a few Ohio Yearly Meeting members of the 1930s realized how active this charismatic minister, Carl Patterson, actually was outside the Society of Friends. He was president of the County Ministerial Association, upon which he exerted considerable influence. He organized non-denominational men's peace meetings in his community in the late 1930s. He also attended the annual gathering of Protestant ministers in Columbus, and he urged Henry Leeds, then a minister at Stillwater Meeting, to go with him. He was also a member of the Ohio Council of Churches Executive Committee. And his awareness that people were praying for him during his ministry of Great Britain and Europe, Carl had an effective sense of corporateness to the Society of Friends. And he was willing to lead and to build a sense of the body, for he enjoyed speaking to large crowds at commencements and halfway picnics. On 3 or 4 occasions during the 1930s, he was able to give the yearly meeting a deeper sense of itself by speaking to the whole yearly meeting with the shutters raised, either report on some Christian service or to urge some important step. The movement for opening up Ohio Yearly Meeting to the influence of the rest of the Society of Friends and to international concerns was certainly fostered by the growing strength of younger Ohio Friends and former Olneyites. By 1929, the Young Friends had finally begun to hold annual summer conferences, and they boldly sent their first epistle to the yearly meeting in 1931. Apparently, young could include anyone under 30. They continued to meet for a summer conference and sometimes for discussion during yearly meeting week as well into World War II. Their leaders might even include yearly meeting members, friends from other places, or even a favorite professor. Their annual conferences were also well reported in the Olney Current, which also reported on some Young Friends conferences elsewhere. Finally, the American Friends Fellowship Conference was held at the boarding school during the summer of 1939 under the leadership of Lewis Benson and Charles Thomas, and Olney teacher Brian Thomas, because became its chairman for the next year. There were even a few signs in the yearly meeting minutes by this time that younger friends were being brought into the work of the yearly meeting. From about 1934, the women's yearly meeting had some very young women on the seating committee, and by 1939, there had been an occasional very young person or even a non-resident intellectual like William Livesey or Willis Harris as a representative from a quarterly meeting to the yearly meeting. During the 1930s, non-resident members, or at least some of them, could not only be effective leaders through the Only Current and the Young Friends conferences and the various gatherings of Ohio Friends, but they sometimes also took an important part in the work of the yearly meeting. Just a decade earlier, according to Howard Brenton, only graduates at Earlham were embarrassed by visiting Ohio ministers, though others at Earlham were profoundly impressed by the authentic powers of such ministers. And there had been some doubt as to whether Ohio's younger friends either believed in the tradition or were proud of it. Since 1932, however, some young only graduates had begun a meeting in Columbus, and all conservative friends moving to the cities were being urged to found new meetings. From that date, many immigrant Ohio friends supported, if they did not start, new meetings in a number of cities. For a time, there was a meeting in Wheeling. Cleveland Friends Meeting, whose 1925 founding group included one Ohio Yearly Meeting member, also had occasional contacts with Ohio Yearly Meeting over the years. For example, James Henderson and Cyrus Cooper had a concern for the people in Cleveland in 1931 to 1932, and eventually in 1966, they became joint members of Ohio Yearly Meeting and Lake Erie Yearly Meeting. As the 1930s came to the end, Ohio Yearly Meeting was in many ways stronger than before, even though its strengths were not always readily apparent. It had become more modern and calling upon the gifts of more of its younger friends than ever before, even allowing non-resident college professors William Blackburn, Willis Harris, and William Livesey to have some role in the works of the yearly meeting. There were some discipline changes. Meetings were allowed to give up unnecessary preparative meetings, and the weddings could be held in the afternoon instead of only in the morning. Nor was it any longer an offense to attend a wedding not under the care of the meeting. In fact, meetings were finally authorized and encouraged to marry couples of which only one person was a friend. In 1935, Short Creek Quarterly Meeting informed the yearly meeting that it would henceforth meet in a joint session instead of holding separate men's and women's business meetings. It is significant it did not ask permission to do this. Already, most bodies in the rest of the society, friends, had met in joint sessions for years. One by one, Ohio Yearly Meetings, members' meetings would do this, and the yearly meeting itself finally did so at the end of the next decade. It must have been a disappointment to many people in 1935 and 1936 that Ohio Yearly Meeting could still not unite on sending delegates to the 1937 Friends World Conference at Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. However, Ohio Friends, including Carl Patterson, had been involved in regional All Friends conferences since 1934. The second such conference was actually held at Olney in 1935, with 90 people from 12 yearly meetings. At the same time, the first non-conservative students were admitted to the school. However, at least 10 active members, including a carload of boarding school staff, did attend the 1937 World Conference unofficially, and the Only Current reported that about 37 people with some Only connections were there. This concludes the reading of Section 8, Second World War and Wider Service, 1930 to 1950, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor. We will finish reading Chapter 8 in the next podcast. The words from our introduction are from Margaret Fell's Letter to the King on Persecution. The music was composed and sung by Paulette Meyer. More information on her website, www.paulettemeyer.com.
We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contention.